Hello dear listener, please subscribe to our channel. Enjoy watching. You ever have one of those days that starts out perfectly normal but ends with your whole life turned upside down? That was me a few months ago. I was just heading home from work, stuck in traffic, thinking about nothing more exciting than what was for dinner. I usually had a routine: work, gym, home, but that day, something told me to take a different route. I'm not one for ignoring gut feelings, so I did. And that's when everything changed. I decided to stop by this old bar I used to go to in my younger days, back when life was simpler and problems could be solved with a cold beer. I hadn't been there in years, but it felt like the right place to kill some time before heading home. Maybe it was nostalgia, or maybe I just needed a break from the monotony. Either way, I pulled into the gravel lot, walked in, and took a seat at the bar. The place hadn't changed much. Same dim lighting, same creaky stools, and the same bartender, old Jack, who looked like he hadn't aged a day. As I sipped my beer, I noticed a couple sitting at the far end of the bar, laughing a little too loudly. The guy had his arm around the woman, leaning in close like they were in their own little world. I couldn't see them clearly from where I was sitting, but something about them seemed familiar. It wasn't until the woman threw her head back, laughing at something the guy whispered in her ear, that I realized why. The woman was my wife, Hannah. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. There was no mistaking that laugh. I'd heard it 1,000 times over the years. It was the same laugh that used to make me smile, that used to make me feel like the luckiest man alive. Now, it just made me feel sick. I didn't confront them. Not right away. Instead, I watched from the shadows, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. I hadn't suspected a thing. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but whose is? We had our ups and downs, but I thought we were solid. Apparently, I was wrong. After about an hour, they got up to leave. I followed them outside, staying just far enough behind that they wouldn't notice me. They walked out to the parking lot, arms around each other like a couple of teenagers sneaking out after curfew. The guy, let's call him Steve, was driving a slick, black sports car. I watched as they got in, laughing and kissing, and then sped off into the night. I sat there in my car for what felt like an eternity, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to chase them down, drag Steve out of that car, and beat him to a pulp. But another part of me, the more calculating part, knew that wasn't the way to go. No, I needed to be smart about this. I needed to figure out who this guy was and why my wife was sneaking around with him. Over the next few days, I did some digging. I didn't tell Hannah what I'd seen. Instead, I acted like everything was normal, going about my business while I pieced together the puzzle. I followed her a few times, watched her meet up with Steve at various places around town, a coffee shop, a park, even a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. It was clear this had been going on for a while. How long? I wasn't sure, but long enough that they had a routine. I finally got a good look at Steve one afternoon when they were sitting outside the coffee shop. He was younger than me by at least 10 years, with that cocky, self-assured look that guys get when they think they've got the world by the balls. He was the kind of guy who probably had women falling all over him, and it pissed me off to no end that Hannah was one of them. But it wasn't just about Steve. It was about Hannah, too. The woman I'd shared my life with for the past 15 years. The woman I thought I knew better than anyone. How could she do this to me? To us? We had a home, a life, a daughter who was just about to head off to college. And she was willing to throw it all away for some fling with a guy who probably wouldn't even remember her name in a few months. I spent a lot of sleepless nights thinking about what to do. I knew I had to confront her, but I also knew I couldn't just let it go. I needed to make sure she understood what she was throwing away. And I needed to make sure Steve paid for what he'd done. The opportunity came about a week later. Hannah told me she was going out with some friends from work, nothing unusual, she did it all the time. But I knew better. I knew she was going to meet Steve. So, I told her I had to work late and wouldn't be home until after midnight. She seemed relieved, which only confirmed what I already knew. That night, I followed her to the motel. I watched as she parked her car, checked her makeup in the mirror, and then walked inside like she didn't have a care in the world. I waited a few minutes, then followed her in. I knew which room they were in. I'd seen them go there before, so I walked right up to the door and knocked. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard Steve's voice on the other side. "Who is it?" "Room service," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. There was some shuffling inside, and then the door opened a crack. I didn't give him a chance to react. I shoved the door open with all my weight, sending Steve stumbling back into the room. Hannah screamed when she saw me, but I didn't even look at her. My eyes were locked on Steve, who was scrambling to his feet, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. "What the fuck?" he yelled, but I didn't give him a chance to say anything else. I tackled him to the ground, my fists connecting with his face before he even knew what hit him. All the rage, all the hurt, everything I'd been holding in for the past few weeks came pouring out as I pounded my fists into his smug, pretty boy face. Hannah was screaming, trying to pull me off him, but I was too far gone. I didn't stop until Steve was lying there, bloody and beaten, barely conscious. When I finally stood up, panting and covered in sweat, I looked at Hannah. She was crying, her hands over her mouth, staring at me like I was some kind of monster. "You did this," I said, my voice low and steady. "You brought this on yourself." She didn't say anything, just stood there, shaking. I grabbed her by the arm and dragged her out of the room, leaving Steve lying there on the floor. I threw her into the passenger seat of my car and drove us home in silence. She tried to talk a few times, but I cut her off, telling her I didn't want to hear a word from her until we got home. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I turned to her and said, "You're going to tell our daughter what you did. You're going to tell her why her family is falling apart. And then you're going to pack your things and get the hell out of my house." "Please, Jake," she sobbed. "I'm sorry. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I laughed bitterly. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk on your way home. This wasn't a mistake, Hannah. This was a choice. You chose to betray me, to betray our family, for what? For some guy who doesn't give a damn about you." She didn't have an answer for that. She just cried harder, and I couldn't even bring myself to feel sorry for her. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built my life with, was gone. She'd been gone for a long time, and I hadn't even noticed. That night, Hannah told our daughter, Emily, what she'd done. I didn't stick around to hear the details. I couldn't bear to see the look on Emily's face when she found out her mother had destroyed our family. I packed a bag and left, not knowing where I was going or what I was going to do next. I just knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I ended up at a cheap motel on the other side of town, the kind of place where nobody asks questions. I didn't sleep much that night, my mind racing with everything that had happened. I kept replaying the fight with Steve in my head, over and over, wondering if I'd gone too far, if I'd crossed a line I couldn't come back from. But every time I thought about what he'd done, what they'd done, I couldn't bring myself to feel any remorse. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I told him I wanted a divorce, and I didn't want to drag it out. I wanted it over and done with as quickly as possible. He agreed, and within a few weeks, the papers were filed. Hannah didn't contest it. She knew she didn't have a leg to stand on. We split everything down the middle, and I kept the house for Emily's sake. She was still in shock, trying to process everything that had happened, but I promised her I'd always be there for her. A year had passed since the night I found out about Hannah's betrayal and beat Steve to a pulp. A lot had changed, but some things, like the pain and anger, stayed the same, simmering just below the surface. I moved back into the house after Hannah left. Emily stayed with me, though she was different now, quieter, more withdrawn. She had grown up too fast, forced to navigate the mess her mother and I had created. Despite everything, I tried to piece together a semblance of a normal life. I threw myself into work, even picked up some new hobbies, but no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that there was unfinished business hanging over me. Steve had disappeared after that night, no surprise there. I heard he left town, probably ashamed or scared, or both. But I never got the closure I needed, the finality that would let me put it all behind me. Then one day, out of the blue, I got a call from an old friend, Mark. He and I had grown up together, but we'd lost touch over the years. Turns out, Mark had moved back to town and was working as a private investigator. We met up for drinks, and after catching up on old times, the conversation inevitably turned to Hannah and Steve. "You ever wonder what happened to that guy?" Mark asked, sipping his beer. "All the time," I admitted. "But I've got no way of finding out." Mark leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know, with my line of work, I've got a few connections. If you wanted to find him, I could help." I looked at him, surprised. "You'd do that?" "Hell, yeah," Mark said with a grin. "Nobody messes with my friends and gets away with it." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to let it go, to move on and focus on rebuilding my life. But another part of me, the part that still burned with anger, wanted to see Steve again, to make sure he paid for what he did. After a long pause, I nodded. "Let's find him." It didn't take long for Mark to track Steve down. Turns out, he was living in a small town a couple of hours away, working a dead-end job at some warehouse. He had rented a rundown apartment in a sketchy neighborhood, the kind of place you go when you want to disappear. Perfect. Mark and I made the trip out there one Friday night. We parked a few blocks away from Steve's place and waited, watching from a distance. Around midnight, we saw him leave his apartment, looking worse for wear, scruffy beard, sunken eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. He walked with a limp, probably from the beating I gave him, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. But it wasn't enough. We followed him as he made his way to a dingy little bar on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years, with a flickering neon sign and a handful of regulars who probably spent every night there. Steve went inside, and we gave him a few minutes before following. The bar was just as grimy on the inside as it was on the outside. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and the smell of stale beer lingered in the air. Steve was sitting alone at the bar, nursing a drink and staring into space. He looked like a man with nothing left to lose, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Mark and I took a seat at a table in the corner, out of Steve's line of sight. We watched him for a while, neither of us saying a word. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel the adrenaline starting to kick in. After what felt like an eternity, Mark leaned over and whispered in my ear. "You sure you want to do this?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at Steve, thinking about everything that had happened, everything that had been taken from me. My marriage, my peace of mind, my family, Steve had played a part in destroying all of it. Finally, I nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." Mark nodded back, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small object. He slid it across the table to me, and I picked it up. It was a pair of brass knuckles, just like the ones I'd used on Steve the first time. I slipped them onto my hand, feeling the cold metal against my skin, and took a deep breath. "Let's go," I said, standing up. We approached Steve slowly, making sure he didn't see us coming. The bar was practically empty, with only a few other patrons scattered around, none of them paying us any attention. As we got closer, I could see Steve more clearly. He looked even worse up close, like he'd been through hell. But I didn't care. He'd put me through hell too, and now it was his turn to pay. I walked up behind him, and before he could react, I grabbed him by the collar and yanked him off the stool. He spun around, eyes wide with fear, and for a moment, I saw the recognition in his eyes. "You," he gasped, his voice trembling. "Yeah, me," I snarled, and before he could say another word, I slammed my fist into his face, the brass knuckles connecting with a sickening thud. Steve crumpled to the floor, clutching his nose, blood pouring down his face. He tried to crawl away, but I kicked him in the ribs, hard, knocking the wind out of him. He let out a choked cry, and I kicked him again, this time in the stomach, making him double over in pain. "You think you can just fuck with my life and get away with it?" I growled, kicking him again. You think you can destroy my family and walk away like nothing happened? Steve was whimpering now, too weak to fight back, too scared to even look at me. I grabbed him by the collar again and lifted him up, forcing him to look me in the eye. You ruined everything, I said, my voice low and dangerous. But I'm going to make sure you never forget what you did. I punched him again, over and over, until my knuckles were slick with his blood, until he was barely conscious. When I finally stopped, Steve was lying in a crumpled heap on the floor, barely breathing. I stood over him, panting, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. That's enough, Jake. He's not worth it. I looked down at Steve, at the broken shell of a man lying at my feet, and realized Mark was right. Steve wasn't worth it. He never had been. I dropped the brass knuckles on the floor and walked out of the bar without looking back. Mark followed me, and we drove back to town in silence. Neither of us said a word the whole way back, but I could feel the tension in the car, the unspoken understanding that what had just happened could never be undone. When I got home that night, I sat down on the couch and stared at the wall, replaying everything in my head. The violence, the blood, the look of fear in Steve's eyes, it all felt so hollow now, so meaningless. Revenge hadn't brought me the closure I thought it would. It hadn't made me feel better. If anything, it had made me feel worse. Over the next few days, I tried to go back to my normal routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The anger that had fueled me for so long was gone, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that I couldn't fill. I tried talking to Emily about it, but she was still distant, still struggling with everything that had happened. One night, about a week later, I got a call from Mark. He sounded serious, more serious than I'd ever heard him before. Jake, we need to talk, he said. About what? I asked, not sure I wanted to hear the answer. It's about Steve. My heart sank. What about him? He's dead, Jake. They found him in his apartment yesterday. Looks like he OD'd on something, but the cops are looking into it. They've got questions, and I'm not sure how much longer I can keep them off your back. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. You think they know? I don't know, Mark said. But we need to be careful. This could get ugly real fast. After I hung up, I sat there in the dark, my mind racing. Steve was dead. Whether it was an overdose or something else, I couldn't help but feel responsible. I'd pushed him to the edge, and now he was gone. And the cops were sniffing around, looking for answers. If they connected the dots, if they figured out what I'd done, it could all come crashing down. I spent the next few days on edge, waiting for the knock on the door, the moment when the cops would come for me. But it never came. The investigation into Steve's death went cold, and eventually, the cops stopped asking questions. It seemed like I was in the clear, but the weight of what I'd done never really left me. I tried to move on, to focus on Emily and rebuilding our lives, but it was harder than I thought. The guilt, the regret, it all lingered, haunting me in. If you leave a comment, tell us what you think about the story you heard. It's important to us and will help us find and tell stories that you find interesting. Thank you for watching us.